Hi, we might get going now. My name is Michael Duffy. I'd like to welcome you all here today, including the people who are in the room and the people who are with us on Zoom. I know there's a lot of people out there around the state coming in both from libraries and they bought their own tickets, or people who've been facilitated by libraries. So welcome to all of you. And the people on Zoom, if you'd like to send in questions while we're speaking, please do so via chat, and we'll do our best to answer them in the last 20 minutes or so of the program. I want to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose site this magnificent library is built, and also thanking our sponsors, who include the City of Sydney and the library itself, and Create New South Wales. Our guest today is Matt Condon, who has written a string of very well-received literary novels in his younger days, such as A Night at the Pink Poodle and The Trout Opera, before turning to crime. And in that field, he's published the important Three Crooked Kings trilogy about police corruption in Brisbane, and The Night Dragon, which is about Brisbane killer and career criminal Vincent O'Dempsey, that we'll be talking about a lot today. And that led to a very successful podcast called Ghostgate Road, which has now had over 1 million downloads, which suggests a pretty intense interest in the subject. And I think that's a good thing, because something that struck me writing about true crime over the years is just how little people in New South Wales anyway know about the rich criminal history of Queensland. So we're about to learn a lot more of it. So can you join me, please, in welcoming Matt Condon? Matt, back in the 1990s, you're pretty well a literary novelist, one of the most successful up-and-comers. You used to drink martinis with Frank Morehouse at the Bayswater Brasserie.
Oh, stop it.
And you wrote these very successful books, but then your last novel, I think, was published 14 years ago. And as I said, you basically turned to crime. What happened?
Well, I turned to writing crime books. I didn't turn to crime, Michael. But you're absolutely right. And, you know, I'll be honest with you, with The Trout Opera, I thought that was my big book. The final manuscript came in at about 240,000 words, was cut back substantially, but I gave everything I had to that novel, and it just landed outside and nothing happened. And I thought, I had a crisis of confidence. Why am I doing this? Why am I, it took me 11 years to write that book, and I gave it everything I had. And I just sort of sat back for 6 months, 12 months and thought, what will I do? Do I need to plow this field again? And by complete chance, a friend of mine in Brisbane took me to lunch. Doug Hall, his name was. Doug was head of the Queensland Art Gallery for many years. And in fact, Doug was responsible for the Gallery of Modern Art over there on the southern bank of the Brisbane River, beautiful building. And Doug said, look, I'm thinking of, wanted to write a book about how famous people first met each other, a sequence of essays. And I wanted to write about when Terence Lewis, the former police commissioner, first met Joh Bjelke-Petersen. He thought that'll be a fantastic essay. He said, I've written, very old fashioned, I've written a letter to Lewis, and he's written a letter back to me. I've since decided I'm not going to do this book, but Terry wants someone to, quote, write his story. And would you be interested in meeting him? And I thought, well, what have I got to lose? You know, I would love to meet. I'd only met him once when I hijacked him as a young police roundsman in the undercroft of the police academy over a story I was writing. I wanted to comment, and I was summarily dismissed. So I thought, oh, let's meet Terry again, you know, in retirement. It would be fascinating. Just curiosity, I couldn't resist it. Went to his house. I'll never forget this day, February 1, 2010. It was about 5 minutes past 10 in the morning, and I knocked on the fly screen door. He came to the door, the shadowy elderly man, perfectly parted hair, beautifully ironed shirts. You know, he's meticulous, Terry Lewis. And he opened the screen door and he said, come in. And I stepped, it was almost, I can see it now in slow motion. I stepped through that door and I thought, there goes 10 years of my life. And it's actually now been almost 12. So I got entirely engrossed in Lewis. I interviewed him for 3 years on and off. And that kicked off this sequence of books, which I'm still mired in.
Indeed, and there's a lot more to talk about, but it's like one of those sort of initiating events in a movie or something. The fact that he wanted to talk to you. I mean, why do you think he did? Because that's not something that strikes you, is there's not many people like him in Australia who have wanted to talk about the good old days.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I've thought about it long and hard. So his wife, Hazel, died in October 2009. So he was still in grieving, I guess. He's not a man that enjoys being by himself. He's just one of those human beings that has to have somebody around. And I think he was lonely. And I think he honestly believed, naively, that I would simply be there to transcribe everything that he said and then arrange the words into a nice story as told by Terence Murray Lewis. What I actually did was I would interview him once a week for an hour and a half and get in my car after that interview, and I'd immediately begin researching what we just talked about so I could verify it, find witnesses, go to documents and try and gauge how much he was lying to me or he wasn't. I worked out after doing the trilogy, 3 volumes, years of work. I went back to my first ever transcript with Terry Lewis on that first day. And he lied to me within the first 20 minutes of 3 years of interviews. So that's what I was dealing with. And the difficult thing too was to in a way, keep him on the hook so that I could get everything I needed. And he had a garage, a suburban 2-vehicle garage, absolutely filled top to bottom with cases of documents, almost like a basement library. And there would be a little walkway between the boxes. And he would give me some of those documents. He had a special locked room, which was his special documents. I got to look in there, but I never got to riffle through it. But, an absolutely obsessive archivist, diarist, as we know, his diaries really sank him at the Fitzgerald inquiry and his trial. So it was fascinating, but in the end, I was tearing my hair out and couldn't wait to get out of his presence. It was depressing. I knew he'd completely lied to me for a very long time, and it was never going to change. And I had to say, stop, I'm now going to go and write. And he cut all ties with me when the second volume was published.
Interesting times. What, any reflections on the experience of writing non-fiction so intensely compared to fiction? What different parts of you does that draw on?
Yeah, well, obviously I wanted to make the trilogy a great read. It's an enormous volume of material that I had to navigate through. So I had to make some very important decisions that I would with a novel. And it clicked with me one day. I was driving in the car and I was thinking, how am I going to write these books? And then it simply occurred to me, well, I'm going to treat every character as if they're in a novel, but they actually did live. And these are actually the things that they said. So in the books, you will note that I do have, descriptions of landscape and buildings, and I do have, I've transposed, direct dialogue from documents so that it is like characters talking to each other. The other thing, the big tip, I think, too, you mentioned Frank Morehouse earlier, but and has been a great mentor of mine in my younger years. And I never forgot a thing Frank said to me. Frank had published, I think, the final volume of his Edith Campbell Berry trilogy, which won the Miles Franklin. And it was selling really well, prior to the Miles Franklin. And he couldn't understand why people were coming up to him and saying, I couldn't put your book down. He said, no one's ever said that to me. He said, but I think I worked it out. He said, I decided to use really short chapters and it just keeps people going. And I remembered that from Frank, and I thought, okay, if I'm going to keep people engrossed and moving forward with these stories, let's just do these short, sharp bits and see how that works. And that became the structure.
There you go. That's the tip for all of you out there, if any of you are writing a book, short chapters. let's just talk very briefly about corruption in general. I've written a bit about corruption of police and politicians in New South Wales, and this is sort of background, a bit of a link between what Matt's just been talking about and Vincent O'Dempsey. It occurred to me and my friend Nick Horton when we wrote some books about Sydney that corruption is often based on prohibition. The government prohibits some popular pleasure like gambling or drinking at certain times, and that creates an illegal industry to provide those pleasures, and that generates a huge amount of money, and then that leads to the corruption. But it also occurred to us there's an awful lot of complicity amongst the audience or the market, if you like. There's a lot of people out there that actually want, you know, the services that have been offered, whether they be prostitution or the chance to gamble away from the racetrack. And that makes corruption perhaps a less black and white subject than many people now would like to think. And it affects the whole culture. Did you come to any thoughts along those lines about Brisbane, about the effect that corruption had over those decades and decades?
Yeah, it's still being felt today. The actions of a handful of men, and we can trace this back. In fact, I'm doing one more book in this series, and that will be the Prelude volume. So this is the foundation, the origin story that leads up to the first volume, which is Terry Lewis being inducted as a constable in 1948. So I'm telling the real origin story of all of that. So this stretches back, you can almost pin it to one man, Francis Eric Bischoff, who would become Commissioner of Police in Queensland in 1958. Bischoff initiated what became known as the joke, which was the Queensland version of police corruption. It had a number of iterations over time, but the joke was essentially, and this is where Queensland is entirely unique, not just in Australia, but possibly in the history of corruption in the world, in that the joke was always set up for the police involved in the joke to run and totally control and more often than not initiate the corruption. So anyone coming from Sydney who wanted to commit a crime, they had to get the okay from the Queensland Police to do that. They had to explain why they were, for example, in Brisbane, if they were picked up by the consorting squad or whatever. The police totally controlled the corruption and the crime. Whereas in Sydney, you had more colourful entrepreneurs like the Freemans and the Paddles Andersons and the Lenny McPhersons and the like that had their own tribal systems. In Queensland, you had to get through the skin of the police because they ran the show, which is an entirely unique situation compared to down here. And, you know, the famous Rat Pack, of course, evolved Terry Lewis, Tony Murphy, and Glenn Hallahan. And they ruled the roost through the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And of course, ultimately, one of the Rat Pack becomes the commissioner. So it's like the rats in charge of the cheese factory, essentially. And, you know, the impact was not just, we're not just talking prostitution, vice, SP bookmaking. They had their fingers in every pie that they could get it into. It reminds me when you watch The Sopranos, I rewatched that recently. They wake up in the morning, these gangsters, and you know, what are we going to do today to earn a quid? This is exactly how the Rat Pack operated. And so their influence and impact was everywhere. They had, you know, defiled the judiciary. They had underlings in the public service. They were everywhere. And the Fitzgerald inquiry, you know, Tony Fitzgerald told me that if we had to actually try and cover everything that we needed to have covered in the inquiry, it would have taken 100 years to do that. It took, as it was, 2 years, which is still a long time. But Queensland society still feels the shakes and the tremors from what those men got up to for decades.
One last question before we turn specifically to Vincent Odempsey, although again it's relevant. Can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between police and informers?
Yeah, this is a very, very, as you would know, Michael, a very, very grey area. when we're talking, for example, about Mr. Vincent O'Dempsey, you know, even his criminal colleagues, many of whom I interviewed for the book and the podcast, simply couldn't understand how a criminal of that caliber could spend so little time in prison. How is that possible? Given he's currently charged with a murder, for example, in Warwick in 1964. So he spends some time in Bogger Road in the 1960s. And then there's a major stretch for drugs in the 1980s. But apart from that, he's free to do as he wishes in the wider world. And the only solution to that makes sense is that he was a key informant to a key detective who was corrupt, and that was Tony Murphy in Brisbane. So you have that relationship of informant. As the great Jim Slade, he was an ex-police officer largely responsible for triggering the Fitzgerald inquiry thanks to his courage. Jim Slade said it's a simple equation. If you're the best detective, you have the best informants. You have to have the best informants. So for Murphy as the #1 detective, who was the biggest criminal around? It was Vincent O'Dempsey. So the minute that relationship of informant and detective was established, certainly in the minds of these old crooks who are now in their 70s and 80s, everything fell into place for them. Bang, 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 bang. Everything, every little moment or discussion that they'd had with Vince about something went, of course, that makes complete sense. But, and you know, that is one of the worst things you can be labeled as, and that's a, you know, quote, dog who rats out on his mates. But they all, this is the thing about criminals, which I love too, certainly in the books that I've done, that I've interviewed, they all ratting on each other all the time. You know, they're always saying, you know, I'll never give up a mate. And every single one of them has tipped someone in to benefit themselves at some point. So, but the informant relationship, while it can be incredibly rich and effective for a police officer, you're stepping into an area whereby how much rope do you give your informant? I mean, and do you not see aspects of that person's behavior in order to keep facilitating the relationship? Where do you draw the line? That's the difficult thing.
And that's a challenge for honest cops as well as dishonest ones, isn't it? Yeah. The same thing happened in Sydney. Lenny McPherson, for example, was the main informant for the leading corrupt cop of his era called Ray Kelly. And yeah, the funny thing is Lenny was known to be an informer from his early years. He was known as Lenny the Pig for a while until people got too scared to call him that. And the same thing happened with Roger Rogerson and Neddy Smith. And one of the biggest of the early ICAC inquiries is actually about the relationship between police and informers. So it's a persistent problem. Let's move to Vince Odempsey anyway. I'm not sure. Can I ask how many of you have actually read Matt's book, just to get a sense of how much detail we should go into here? Okay, and I've just got to say, and I mentioned this before, that I was struck while reading it. We're going to be talking about the Whiskey Go-Go fire in a moment. You know, this horrific incident, and it's striking how little we in New South Wales know about what happened, even though there was a very close relationship between many Sydney criminals and Brisbane ones, which we'll also talk about. But anyway, let's start at the beginning. Vince O'Dempsey, can you just tell us a bit about his childhood?
Yeah, so Vince, his forebears moved out from Ireland in the 1850s. They moved to the town of Warwick, which is about 160 k's sort of southwest of Brisbane. Agricultural town, you know, a lot of big churches, and they grow some nice roses. But Vince's family, a farming background through and through. He was born in 1938, and his mother, there were 9 children in the O'Dempsey family. His mother, incredibly staunch Catholic, went to mass every day in St. Mary's Church. And she and her husband are still remembered in the parish newsletter. There will be one published tomorrow with their names in it. But gave birth to Vincent, who the mother indicated to friends and relatives that there was something wrong with him even by the age of about 4. Apparently he was incredibly clever, but got into trouble at school because he was a smart aleck, but also he was colorblind, and there were a lot of problems with teachers. And but at 15 he was becoming restless, and he was put into a psychiatric ward in Toowoomba, and there at 15 he was officially diagnosed as a psychopath. He went back to Warwick, never went back to school, and became the local tough, essentially. By the time he was 18, 19, there were numerous petty charges against him, but he had a charge of indecent assault of a child when he was 19. So, and by the ages of 20 and 21, he's doing armed robberies and you name it. He's a full-blown criminal in the making. In 1964, he was working on the then Warwick Dam, which was under construction, and a friend of his by the name of Raymond Vincent Allen, little Tommy Allen, he and Vince did Vince did a robbery, retrieved a safe, blew the safe open. Vince was obsessed, even from a young age, with firearms and especially with explosives, and became a master of explosives. He actually hand-built out from scratch his own machine gun. He was that obsessive with weapons. So they do this safe robbery. Vince ends up in Sydney, picks up, dumps the car, etc., comes back to Warwick and tells Tommy Allen about what he's been up to in terms of the robbery. Tommy gets into trouble separately with a teenage girl at the time, and the police. And he says to police, "Look, if you go easy on me, I'll tell you all about Vince and the safe robbery." So he's going to appear as chief witness against Vincent O'Dempsey in Vince's first serious trial in 1964 in Warwick. And of course, Vince is seen with Tommy Allen in his custom Holden driving down the main street of Warwick. The court case occurs. Tommy Allen is called in to give evidence. There's no Tommy Allen, and he's vanished off the face of the earth. Vince, about a year and a half ago, Vince has been charged with the 1964 murder of Raymond Tommy Allen, which we think may have been his first murder. But of course, you know, he was never charged at the time. Vince then heads to Sydney to let things cool off, and he starts befriending some of Sydney's more colourful gangsters, including Frederick Paddles Anderson and a guy called Stewart John Regan. And O'Dempsey becomes obsessed with Regan. He's the sort of prototype gangster for Vince. Regan, you know, drinks orange juice, doesn't drink alcohol, doesn't smoke. This is what Vince does. He completely emulates, Vince is a vegetarian, you know, the body is a temple. And it's also so that he is constantly, he's on guard for potential capture. You know, Vince over the years evolved these systems of observation. He was very briefly in the army before he was kicked out for sexual assault in the showers at Holdsworthy. But apart from that, he learned some tricks about disguising himself in the bush in the army, and he would always annoy his gangster friends. They'd roar with laughter, and Vincent would say, "Look, well, you know, you can be a tree. You just stand still long enough, people will walk straight past you." And he had all these crazy, mad ideas of, you know, hiding from authority. And so he goes to Bogger Road in Brisbane on some offences, 2 stretches in the 1960s, and then emerges in 1970 as this hardened, full-blown gangster.
Did he have a tough time at Bogger Road, or was he the tough one?
Well, one of the guards that I interviewed that guarded him for a time in Bogger Road said he was the most terrifying and petrifying human being he had ever seen. He said in all of his 30 years as a prison guard, he was the scariest, just his presence.
And this was in his very early 20s.
This was in his early to mid 20s, exactly. This prison guard and I recorded this, had a recurrent dream years after all of this. And his nightmare would be driving in a car, breaking down in the bush, getting out of the car, and then seeing Vince O'Dempsey coming down the road towards him. He said this was his permanent nightmare. And, you know, Vince was known as, you know, Silent Death was his nickname in the 60s. Very self-contained, kept to himself, didn't shoot his mouth off, very structured, very disciplined.
It's interesting because, you know, I've looked into the background of lots of serious criminals, and you can kind of explain in inverted commas or see the path they took. You know, they went to a boys' home, they got abused, they had a terrible childhood, shocking family background, but this one is different. He just seems to have almost fallen into the world perfectly formed, almost, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean, terrifyingly so. I think that's right. I mean, it's, you know, it's interesting that his mother was noticing something, but not being able to get a handle on what it was. Other people feeling uneasy around him, even as a child, and then the formal diagnosis at 15. Things start to slot into place when you read the doctor that diagnosed him as a psychopath was quizzed during a 1980 inquest into the disappearance of a woman called Barbara McCulkin and her 2 children. Ultimately, Vince was convicted of that triple murder. But in 1980, the psychologist who'd done the diagnosis, he was interviewed in the witness box and explained, it's fascinating reading, explained how he arrived at that, and, you know, how Vince was a special case, if you like.
We're not in any way going to try and go over all the details of Vince's life. I really strongly urge you to read the book because it's just full. Every second page has got something that's almost, it's incredible. It's almost unbelievable, except it actually happened. It's a really striking character, Vince. And I don't think, still not that well known outside of Queensland, but deserves to be. Let's just jump ahead to the Whiskey A Go-Go fire of 1973, because it's absolutely crucial. Do you mind just telling us briefly what that was? Because I've asked a lot of people about this in preparation for this interview, and virtually no one I can find in Sydney actually has the faintest idea about it, even now.
Yeah, and I mean, that doesn't surprise me, but it's also permanently surprising that, you know, we deal with stories and we try and grab people and interview them. And I felt this way with the trilogy of books about Terry Lewis, that if I hadn't done those books when I did, half those cast of characters would be dead. Like, it was right on the brink of a story falling into this sort of infinite amnesia. You know, when the people with the stories disappear, the story disappears. And it's very much like the Whiskey A Go-Go, which at the time was, you know, aside from our horrendous history of mistreatment of Indigenous people, it certainly was, to that point, the biggest mass murder in white Australian history. It was only eclipsed by Port Arthur. So you have in Brisbane, leading up to that night, which was March 8, 1973, you've got a series of little fires that are breaking out at nightclubs and restaurants in Brisbane. One in particular at Torino's nightclub, it was a deliberate insurance arson job. And indeed, Peter Hall, one of the arsonists, has since become a good friend during the researching of these books. And Peter told the court, of course, during O'Dempsey's trial for murder, he told the court of that night and how they went in and what they did, and they blew it up. And no one had ever been charged with that until Peter spilled the story in 2017 in a court of law. But so it was an insurance job. And then, incredibly, there were rumors going around Brisbane that a nightclub full of people was going to be hit, that there were Sydney gangsters that wanted to come up to Brisbane and take over the nightclub scene. And they had to make an emphatic point, and that would be to burn a nightclub with people in it. And the police almost had the exact date. There was intelligence coming from everywhere saying, look, it might be the Whiskey, and it could possibly be Thursday, the 8th of March. And there was all of this intelligence around, and yet it still happened. So on that night, at close to just after 2 a.m., a car pulls up in front of the club. There's about 50 people upstairs in this 2-level club. The building is still there, and only recently I'm doing a project at the moment with my friend Kelly. We actually went into what was the Whiskey A Go-Go nightclub. It was the most eerie feeling to walk in there. It's now, it was an empty office, but where the kitchen was, there was still a staff kitchen, and it was just chilling to be inside of that building where, 50 years ago, 15 people died within 3 minutes of the fire. So the car pulls up, three men, or was it 2, according to the police, get out, spill petrol downstairs at the bottom of the stairs into the club, light it and take off. The fire goes up the stairwell and fills the club with black smoke, and everyone dies from asphyxiation. And they're all piled where the exit was locked and they couldn't get out. A lot of people did get out, and I've spoken to survivors of that night, but 15 young people didn't make it. So the hunt was on, of course, to quickly arrest the perpetrators.
Sorry, can I just say one thing about that? We talked earlier, there's a podcast now that Matt's made about this, and it's one of the reasons that the podcast is a different way of telling stories. You can actually hear some of the survivors talking about that night and some of the witnesses. It's incredibly effective, and it's something you just can't get out of a book. So I should recommend the podcast series as well. Sorry, go on.
So 2 men are arrested, John Andrew Stewart and James Finch, 2 career criminals. There was an inquest that was begun on the afternoon of the fire, which was Thursday afternoon. The inquest continued on the Friday. Finch and Stewart were arrested on Sunday, and the inquest was closed on the Monday, and that was it. It was closed until this year, when the inquest was finally reopened. Don't get me started on the inquest, because it's not a happy memory at the moment for me, but what's been going on there. But so Finch and Stewart were arrested. They claimed they were verbaled. I think they were, but I still think they were responsible for the crime. They go to prison for life. Stewart is found dead in his cell in January 1, 1979, and Finch is extradited back to the UK in 1988. Finch dies 2 weeks before the resumption of the inquest this year of COVID-19. Shorty Dubois, Vince's co-accused in the McCulkin murders, which is related to the whiskey crime, he drops dead. He's found dead in his cell just before the start of the inquest this year. You can be a conspiracy theorist or not on those deaths, but so the whiskey is wrapped up. It's nice and neat. It was Stewart and Finch, and that's it. That's all you need to know. In fact, it was so much more complicated. There were so many more people involved, including corrupt police, that story had a lid put on it until 2021 with the opening of the inquest.
And part of that lid was the McCulkin murders.
That's right. So March 8, 73 is the fire, but one of the men involved in driving that fuel to the front of the club was a man called Billy McCulkin. Billy was a local crook and thug and was married to a woman called Barbara. And they had 2 children, Vicky and Leanne, who were 13 and 11. Now, scroll forward 10 months. Billy has separated from Barbara. He's found another woman. Billy always did. Barbara's left alone with her children in Dorchester Street in Highgate Hill. And one evening, a man called Vincent O'Dempsey and his mate, Shorty Dubois, arrive at the house with a carton of beer and decide to have a party with Barbara. She and the 2 girls are never, ever seen again after that night. But as I said, in 2017, Vincent Odempsey was convicted of that triple murder. It's an horrendous crime. I have detailed it to the lengths that I think is publicly appropriate. in the podcast, but there are things that those men did to those children that if you hear it, you will never unhear it. It is one of the most horrific crimes in Australian history. So that was a knock-on effect from the whiskey. Barbara knew too much about her husband's involvement, and she was starting to talk to other people about her suspicion that Billy McCulkin had a hand in the murder of 15 people. So she was shut down. And this story, it is a masterpiece in terms of how crooked police and criminals kept this story contained for so many decades. And they're still trying to do it, even with the contemporary inquest happening. It went for 2 weeks, it's been adjourned and will resume next year. There are still people who will do everything to make sure this story does not come out, the full story, which is phenomenal to think after half a century.
It is. It's like some sort of Greek tragedy, but it just keeps happening. We're going to skip a lot of murders and a lot of violence because we just don't have time, and that's why I said you need to read the book. But Matt, in the podcast, you give various estimates for how many people Vincent Odempsey killed, and the numbers can be quite horrific. I mean, there's a lot of talk of some figure between 33, maybe 100. Another source suggests it was 6. What's your best guess after all the work you've done on it?
Well, I guess there's a bottom line in that Odempsey self-admitted to a partner, which was given, this information was given in evidence at his committal hearing. He indicated to a partner that self-admitted that he had committed 33 murders. But then I've spoken to many of his criminal colleagues of the day, and several are convinced that that their line is he only told his partner it was 33 to make her feel a bit better, because they're convinced it's over 100. Now, will that ever be proven? Probably not. Did he have any involvement in the Whiskey A Go-Go? I don't know, although Justice Peter Applegarth at his sentencing in 2017 indicated that Odempsey had some form of hand in the Whiskey A Go-Go, which prompted the new inquest. So what his role was, I don't know, and we may never know, because he is represented with legal counsel at the inquest. And in fact, in the first opening week of the inquest, he was sitting in the dock, manacled in the dock, to listen to proceedings. Extraordinary situation. So, I mean, he's now, in his early 80s. Incredibly, we just met a man in the green room who had met Odempsey in the Arthur Gorrie Correctional Centre in Brisbane fairly recently. And, you know, he's fit. He was a vegetarian before the word was invented. He just looks after himself incredibly. He may go to 100, but, you know, I highly doubt he will ever be released from prison.
You say in the podcast that you suspect there, or some people suspect there may be a graveyard where he's put a lot of his victims, and you actually dig up some soil from a possible location, I think, and you were talking about maybe having it analysed. Did that ever happen?
Well, we worked out we informed the police, by the way, of that. That was obviously the right thing to do, but the cost of that analysis was so enormous. However, having said that, only relatively recently, the man who's been on the hunt for the graveyard somewhere on the outskirts of Warwick has found another location that he believes might even be closer to the mark, not far from where that original site was that I went to. Since the podcast came out, people in Warwick have been driving all through the bush trying to find Vince's graveyard. They've been, you know, Geiger counters and they're everywhere, all over the place, trying to find, you know, doing the right thing, trying to find, for example, are the remains of Barbara and those 2 girls there, you know. But the story of the graveyard sounds like a joke, and it sounds like a cliche. But that story has been with and in and around Vince since the early 1960s. And, you know, certainly criminal cohorts, one in particular who's only in his mid-50s, but he was a young apprentice to Vince, You just have to mention the graveyard and he'll go on the stories that Vince has told him about this, that, and the other. So, yeah, it's a spooky, almost unreal element to this man, but then everything about him is almost unreal.
How well known was he in Queensland until your podcast? I mean, to the wider community.
You know, I don't think outside of the criminal milieu, hardly think he was known at all. I mean, you know, I remember as going into the Queensland newspapers archives, and we've got a very, very good library and archives there up until they sacked all the librarians in the last few years. And I found a file on him. It's only like 2 sheets of paper in it. And I thought, how can this guy be this sort of incredible uber criminal? And there's nothing on him. There's no photographs of him. I couldn't be explained. But, you know, I think the explanation of his criminal colleagues that indeed he was a very powerful informant to a very corrupt policeman for many years explains the radio silence.
Okay, I might just ask one question and then open it up to questions from you, the audience. But you referred to the inquest earlier, and I've got to ask you, I mean, what do you make of it, the current proceedings?
It's such a difficult puzzle to unravel, the Whiskey A Go-Go puzzle. And, you know, you go into the inquest and you have, you know, the first 2 rows in the public gallery are, for example, direct relatives of people who died in that fire. And you want the story to come out for them. You want them to have a fuller picture of what happened to their loved ones. I spoke to this amazing woman whose sister, she was staying with her on that night, and she said to her sister, I'm off to go dancing at the Whiskey Go-Go. And she has this recollection of this beautiful 24-year-old dressed to the nines. She can even still smell the perfume she was wearing when she went out the front door, and never saw her again. She died in the blaze. And now this woman is in her 80s. And you're crying out for them to be able to have some better measure of what happened. I'm not sure whether a 2-week, 4-week, 6-month inquest would be able to tease out the complications of this story, given the passage of time, the passing of so many witnesses. It's going to be very, very difficult for everybody involved.
Yeah, it's 50 years now, isn't it? So the people who are still trying to suppress it must have a bit of age to them, but obviously not without influence.
But the instruments were put in place early. So, for example, the trial of Stewart and Finch in September, October 1973. The early days of that trial involved calling several police to the stand to ask them about when Finch and Stewart were brought into the police station once they were arrested. Were they assaulted? In terms of their statements, did they say those things in the statements? Why didn't they sign the statements? What happened in that moment? Bear in mind, there were 2 very senior detectives that were flown up to Brisbane to help their Queensland colleagues, and that was Detective Noel Morey and his partner, Roger Rogerson. So they were a part of the Whiskey investigation, and they were a part of the interrogation of Stewart and Finch. Now, at the trial, the first 100 pages of the trial transcript deal with the alleged verbal of Stewart and Finch by police. The pages of that transcript have gone missing. Nobody can find them. This is an official judicial transcript of a trial. Now, you can imagine even in that day, a number of copies would have to have been made to be given to the defense, to be given to all around the place. There'd be copies. Nobody can find the transcript involving the police verbaling of Stewart and Finch. I mean, I find that astonishing. But someone's thinking ahead. Someone has thought 50 years ahead. Someone has thought there might be someone who comes along. There might be me or an historian or a journalist. And if they come along, they'll be looking for this. So let's get rid of that. someone did it magnificently, whoever it was.
As I said, there's so much more that could be said. But anyway, would any of you like to ask questions, please, or anyone on Zoom? You can send questions through to us now via chat. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I ask a question about Terry Lewis? What did he do with the money?
Yeah, it wasn't. Excuse me. It wasn't.
Sorry, I'm supposed to repeat the questions. I forgot for our friends on Zoom.
Yes.
Terry Lewis, the corrupt policeman, what did he do with the money?
So as far as we can find out, in the early to mid 80s, he suddenly became very attracted to property investment. And he bought a number of apartments off the plan overlooking the Brisbane River. And also he had his home in 12 Garfield Drive. It was an old Queenslander when he and Hazel bought it in the early 1960s. They had it demolished and then it was replaced by a modern, quote, mansion with a pool and indeed a gun room that housed the biggest private gun collection in Australia. Terry Lewis was a gun collector as well. And that house was, in fact, architecturally designed pro bono by the guy that designed the Queensland Art Gallery. So Terry was very well connected with a lot of people. So there was, and also in his statements to Fitzgerald, he claimed to have won an enormous amount of money on the races. He was an incredibly successful punter. And I think the statistics in the end put it down to that year in, year out, Terry won about 86% of his bets, which is pretty darn good for any punter. So there's that, and that accounted for tens of thousands of dollars too of income coming into the Lewis household. I think people think that we're talking millions and millions of dollars here. We're not talking that at all. I mean, even back in the 50s, Terry was grateful for £5 in the back pocket if he could pick that up, say for protection money for a prostitute. Terry was always, if there's a little bit of gravy, little bit of extra gravy on the meat, then I'm happy. He wasn't, as far as I can tell, an incredibly greedy man. He was greedy, but to the point where he was happy with what came in rather than, screaming about his missing millions. So there's property, all that sort of stuff, holidays, and a lot of these guys did spend their money on daily or family living. For example, the Sydney Madam Shirley Briffman famously was interviewed by police, blew the whistle in 1971. She turned up dead in 1972. Nevertheless, she broke down the money of how she paid. She was a madam in Brisbane as well. So she talked about how she paid the Rat Pack, what money they got. This is in the 1960s. And she would go on about how, for example, Tony Murphy would come to her and say, look, I need a new driveway at my house. And of course, Shirley paid for it. My kids need piano lessons. I want to send my daughter to that private school. So this is where the money all added up. It was you didn't see it on the surface. It was about daily and weekly, monthly living.
I've just got a Zoom question here, and then we'll come to the back to the room. Matt, do you ever feel intimidated as a truth teller? And do you feel safe even today? From Ron Dick.
Well, I've got my bodyguard Kelly here today, so I do feel safer. There have been some incidents, nothing out of the ordinary. Oh, a guy tried to break into a house, but he might have just been a housebreaker. Legal threats, of course, have come in, but I'm finding wood to touch, nothing ever progressed to court. I've been abused in my face at book events. I've had the families of corrupt police officers screaming at me at the backs of auditoriums, saying that I'm a liar and I make things up and I'm a pig and all of this. You get that. You're going to get that because what my work is in one thing it is doing, it is trammeling old white guys' legacies, and especially old white police guys. And, you know, I'm tarnishing their mighty record. And, you know, in some instances I found, and I feel sorry in many respects for many of the families in that, you know, suddenly they're picking up the Three Crooked Kings trilogy and there's Grandad in the index. And they're going, what do you mean? What did Grandad do? I've never heard this story. Then a lot of them never tell their families, of course. So then their families live this life of beatifying Dad and the great inspector and the great commissioner, not knowing the full truth. And then it's a shock, and their, you know, their whole version of their history alters. And I do have enormous empathy for that, but it's a byproduct of what happens when you're trying to commit this history to paper.
It must be a shock to learn that you spent your childhood playing cricket on the Shirley Briffman driveway or whatever. Question down the back.
I think that's a,
sorry.
Yeah.
The question is that, as Matt said, a lot of intelligence came in about the forthcoming Whiskey A Go-Go fire before it actually happened. And could he talk a bit more about that?
I think that's a great question. So there was a piece of intelligence, for example, that came in via an informant to a Commonwealth police officer. He committed that to a memo and passed it on to a Queensland state police officer. That information then never made it into the hands of the Commissioner, Ray Whitrod. However, on the Saturday after the fire, Whitrod went into his office in headquarters and the memo was there on his desk 2 days after the killings. So someone withheld the memo to the Commissioner, and he was questioned at a press conference saying, well, you know, this guy was telling you 2 weeks ago that a club was going to be burned down. And Whitrod said, I've only just seen the memo on my desk. Someone has put it on my desk this morning. So of the many, many motives that were surrounding the Whiskey A Go-Go fire, one of them, a very important one, was political, and that was to discredit Ray Whitrod, the honest commissioner. So I honestly don't think the men that started that fire in their wildest imaginations, I don't think they thought 15 people would end up dead. I don't believe that. It just so happened that that's what happened. It was horrendous. As I said, they were all dead within 3 minutes of the fire being torched, lit. And I think that was an absolutely mind-bending, horrific result that even the killers must have gone, oh my God, this is supposed to be a warning shot, an insurance job, whatever it is. How did 15 people end up dead? We can't go down for 15 murders. So I think that too is part of the equation. And I think a lot of the chicanery and shenanigans going on in terms of police withholding information and not passing things on was all not with the knowledge that 15 people were about to die or 30 people were about to die. It was, you know, going along with something that got completely out of hand.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Maybe one more question if anyone has one. Yeah, please. The question is whether Matt sees any resonance between the Whiskey fire and the Luna Park fire in Sydney.
You're 100% right. It's absolutely, the hair on my neck goes up when I look at the two crimes. I mean, basically you're looking at two events whereby the systems in each state that allowed that to happen were almost identical. Corrupt police, you know, serious gangster involvement. And the weird thing too is when you look at Queensland and New South Wales, you have this permanent mirroring that was going on from the 1950s onwards. So if in Sydney, for example, Queensland looked over the border and thought, gee, there's a rash of arson fires happening here and someone's making a lot of money. The next minute it's happening in Brisbane. So they copied each other too with types of crime that were working at the time. They would literally mirror each other in doing that. And the whiskey is a horrifying mirror of Luna Park. It's just uncanny.
Okay, look, thanks very much, everybody. And thanks, Matt. We're going to have to finish here. In a minute, I'll ask you to thank Matt, but just his book's available for signing on the other side of this building. It's a bit of a trek. And Matt's going to have to go over there now to be at the bookshop. So if you want to have a chat to him, I'm sure you're welcome, but would you mind following him across and we can talk over there? We have to leave this room now. Can you join me, please, in thanking Matt Condon?
Thank you,
Thanks,
Michael.
Matt.
Thank you. Thank you.